November 1950. Nearly 40,000 feet above the frozen ribbon of the Yalu River. The sky up here is brutally clear. Air so thin that jet engines scream just to stay alive. Air so cold that exhaust freezes instantly into long white lines. Contrails. They stretch across the horizon like threads of silk, trembling slowly in the windless upper atmosphere. Far below, the Korean peninsula burns. Cities are shattered. Rail lines twisted. Columns of smoke rise from bridges and supply depots that only weeks earlier had seemed far behind the front. The ground war is collapsing into confusion. Chinese armies are pouring across the northern border in numbers that American planners had never expected. United Nations forces are withdrawing south through frozen valleys, fighting delaying battles in towns that will soon be abandoned. But at 40,000 feet, the war looks strangely quiet. The sky appears empty. Then shapes begin to appear above the Chinese frontier. They emerge slowly from the direction of Antung, an airbase complex just across the river in Manchuria. At first, they are nothing more than silver flashes against the sun. Then the shapes sharpen. Swept wings. Long fuselage. Single engines howling with unfamiliar power. These aircraft are not propeller fighters. They are the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15. When they first appear over Korea in the closing months of 1950, they change the entire character of the war in the sky. Nothing the United States Air Force has in the region can match them. The MiG climbs faster. It flies higher. And its weapons are designed with one specific target in mind: heavy bombers. But the aircraft itself is only part of the story. Inside the cockpit of each MiG sits a pilot who officially does not exist. Their aircraft carry North Korean or Chinese markings. Their uniforms bear the insignia of Allied Communist Air Forces. But the men flying them are Soviet. Many are veterans of the Second World War. They fought in the enormous air battles over Eastern Europe, where Soviet and German aircraft fought across the skies from Stalingrad to Berlin. Some of them survived hundreds of combat sorties against the Luftwaffe. They arrive in Korea with that experience, and with a new aircraft that Soviet engineers believe will dominate the high-altitude battlefield. Among them are pilots who once served under the legendary Soviet ace Ivan Kozydub. For these men, the MiG is not merely another fighter. It is proof of technological progress. Proof that the Soviet Union has entered the jet age with a machine capable of challenging the most powerful air force in the world. Inside briefing rooms across Manchuria, the message is simple. The MiG-15 is superior. Faster than American jets. Higher climbing. More heavily armed. In the minds of many Soviet pilots, the conclusion seems obvious. The aircraft beneath them cannot be beaten. For a brief moment in the winter of 1950, that belief appears almost entirely correct. To understand why, it helps to understand what the air war over Korea looked like before the MiG arrived. When the conflict began in June of 1950, the United States possessed overwhelming control of the air. North Korea's small air force was quickly swept aside. Most of its aircraft were aging propeller-driven fighters left over from the final years of the Second World War. Against modern American jet fighters, they stood little chance. Within weeks, American aircraft were flying combat missions with almost complete freedom. And that freedom made one aircraft especially important: the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was already a legend. 5 years earlier, it had carried out the devastating bombing campaign against Imperial Japan. Flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, it had seemed almost untouchable to enemy fighters. Pressurized crew compartments allowed it to operate higher than most interceptors. Remote-controlled gun turrets protected it from attackers approaching from almost any direction. In the Pacific War, the aircraft had appeared nearly unstoppable. When the Korean War began, American commanders expected it to perform in much the same way: high, fast, and largely safe. The bomber formations began flying north toward rail yards, bridges, supply depots, and military factories supporting the communist war effort. From extreme altitude, they dropped their bombs with the intention of slowing the movement of Chinese and North Korean forces. For months, the missions continued with little opposition. Then the MiG-15 appeared. The aircraft itself was the result of an unexpected twist in the early years of the Cold War. In 1946, the British government agreed to sell several of its advanced jet engines to the Soviet Union. Among them was the powerful Rolls-Royce Nene turbojet, one of the most capable engines of its generation. Soviet engineers quickly studied the design. Within a short time, they produced their own version of the engine, designated the RD-45. Around it, they built a new fighter designed specifically to intercept high-altitude bombers. The result was the MiG-15. Swept wings allowed it to approach speeds close to the sound barrier. Its powerful engine pushed it rapidly toward altitudes beyond 45,000 feet. And mounted in its nose were weapons built not for dogfighting with small fighters, but for destroying large aircraft. Two 23mm cannons, and a massive 37mm cannon capable of tearing through a bomber's structure with only a few hits. Against the B-29, the aircraft was devastating. Soon the skies above Northwest Korea became one of the most dangerous airspaces in the world. American pilots gave the region a name. They called it MiG Alley. MiG Alley stretched along the northwest corner of North Korea, between the Yalu River and the inland city of Sinanju. It lay directly beneath the flight paths used by American bombers heading toward targets near the Chinese border. For the Soviet pilots operating from bases inside Manchuria, the geography offered a critical advantage. United Nations aircraft were forbidden from attacking targets inside China. That meant the MiG pilots could take off from airfields across the Yalu River, climb safely over friendly territory, and cross into Korean airspace only long enough to launch their attacks. If the fight turned against them, they could retreat north across the river where American fighters were not allowed to follow. It was a sanctuary that shaped the entire air war. From their bases near Antung, the MiGs climbed high above the bomber routes and waited. The attacks came suddenly. First came the contrails high above the formation. Then the silver shapes diving through the thin air. Then the thunder of heavy cannon fire. The MiGs slashed through the bomber formations at tremendous speed before climbing back toward China. The tactic was elegant, and it worked. American escort fighters, such as the early jet aircraft operating in Korea, struggled to reach the same altitudes quickly enough to intercept the MiGs before they struck. For the crews flying the B-29, the change was immediate and frightening. They began to recognize the warning signs. First the contrails above the formation. Then the descending fighters. Then the violent explosions of cannon shells striking aluminum and fuel tanks. Bombers that had once flown almost unchallenged suddenly found themselves under attack from above. For a brief period in late 1950, the MiG-15 seemed to dominate the skies over Northwest Korea. Those long white contrails stretching across the cold upper atmosphere became a symbol of that dominance. A silent signature written across the sky above the Yalu River. But even as the MiGs claimed the high-altitude battlefield, another aircraft was already on its way to challenge them. Within weeks, a new fighter would arrive in Korea. A swept-wing jet, designed not only to reach the same altitudes as the MiG-15, but to fight it on equal terms. The aircraft was the North American F-86 Sabre, and its arrival would begin rewriting the story of MiG Alley. December 1950. Kimpo Air Base, just south of the ruins of Seoul. The runway is covered in frost. Cold winter wind sweeps across the concrete as a new group of jet fighters rolls to a stop. Ground crews move toward the aircraft, their breath visible in the freezing air. Mechanics circle the machines slowly, studying their swept wings and narrow fuselages. These aircraft are different. Until now, most American jet fighters flying in Korea have struggled to match the performance of the MiG-15 at extreme altitude. They were designed earlier, during the final years of the Second World War, when jet aviation was still new and uncertain. But this aircraft was built with a different enemy in mind: the North American F-86 Sabre. The Sabre represents the United States Air Force's answer to the sudden appearance of the MiG-15 over Korea. Like the Soviet fighter, it carries swept wings designed to remain stable as the aircraft approaches the speed of sound. Its engine is powerful enough to push the aircraft into the same high-altitude battlefield where the MiGs have been operating. But the Sabre also carries something else. Inside its nose sits a radar-assisted computing gun sight. Instead of relying entirely on the pilot's instinct to judge the angle needed to hit a moving target, the system calculates the firing solution automatically once the enemy aircraft is tracked inside the sight. At the speeds common in jet combat, that difference matters enormously, because the fights that are about to begin will not resemble the long-turning battles of the Second World War. They will happen in seconds. 2 days after the first Sabres arrive in Korea, they fly their first mission north. December 17th, 1950. 4 Sabres climb high above the narrow corridor of sky that American pilots have begun calling MiG Alley. Their leader is Bruce Hinton, commander of the 336th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Hinton knows the MiGs are watching. For weeks, Soviet pilots have used the same tactic. They climb high above American aircraft, wait patiently, and then dive down from above with tremendous speed. The earlier American jets cannot match the climb. They cannot reach the same altitude quickly enough to challenge the MiGs before the attack begins. Hinton decides to turn that confidence against them. Instead of climbing immediately to the Sabre's full altitude capability, he keeps his formation slightly lower. From above, the American aircraft resemble the slower jets that the MiGs have already learned to hunt. The trap works. High above the formation, contrails begin to appear. MiG-15s. They roll into their familiar attack pattern, diving from the sun toward the Sabres below. For the Soviet pilots, the situation appears routine. Another quick strike. Another American jet unable to climb away. But as the distance closes, the geometry of the fight changes. Hinton pushes the throttle forward. The Sabre accelerates smoothly. Instead of remaining below the MiGs, Hinton pulls his aircraft into a hard climbing turn. The swept wings bite into the thin air as the fighter climbs toward the attackers. The maneuver surprises the MiG formation. The Sabre does not stall. It does not lose control. Its hydraulically assisted controls remain steady even as the aircraft pushes toward transonic speed. Suddenly, one MiG finds itself directly ahead of Hinton's gun sight. The radar system calculates the lead angle automatically. 650 caliber machine guns fire together. A stream of tracers reaches across the thin air. The rounds strike the MiG along the fuselage and wing route. Smoke pours from the Soviet aircraft's engine as it rolls over and begins a long spiraling descent toward the Korean hills. It is the first confirmed victory of the Sabre over the MiG-15. More importantly, it is the first recorded kill in history between 2 swept-wing jet fighters. For the first time since the MiG arrived over Korea, the aircraft that seemed untouchable has been shot down. But the battle for MiG Alley has only begun. Through the winter of 1950 and into the spring of 1951, the skies above northwest Korea become one of the most intense aerial battlefields on Earth. Sabres and MiGs climb toward 40,000 feet. Contrails carve wide circles across the sky as pilots search for advantage. The 2 aircraft are closely matched. The MiG-15 still holds clear advantages in some areas. It climbs faster and can reach higher altitudes than the Sabre. Its heavy cannons remain devastating weapons against large aircraft. But the Sabre possesses qualities that begin to matter more as pilots gain experience. At high speed, the Sabre remains stable. Near the edge of the sound barrier, its controls respond smoothly, allowing pilots to maneuver even during steep dives or tight turns. The MiG-15, by contrast, begins to struggle under those conditions. At high speed, its controls become heavy. In certain maneuvers, the aircraft can become difficult to recover. In the new world of jet combat, where closing speeds approach 1,000 miles per hour, those differences become critical. But the MiG still demonstrates its power in the role it was designed for. Intercepting bombers. April 12, 1951. High above northwest Korea, the sky fills with aircraft. 39 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers approach the border city of Sinuiju. Their target is a bridge network carrying supplies from China into North Korea. Escort fighters accompany the formation. But high above them, contrails begin to form. MiG-15s climbing from bases across the Yalu River. Within minutes, the Soviet fighters begin their attack. They dive through the bomber formation in coordinated waves, firing short bursts of heavy cannon fire before climbing back toward the thin upper atmosphere. The escorts attempt to intercept, but the MiGs are already moving too fast. The sky fills with smoke. 3 B-29 bombers are destroyed during the attack. 7 more are heavily damaged before they can escape south. The battle becomes known among American airmen as Black Thursday. It is the most devastating single day suffered by the B-29 during the Korean War. Strategic bombing missions over the region are suspended for months while commanders reconsider how to protect the once dominant bomber. And high above the Korean peninsula, the contrails of departing MiG-15s stretch across the sky once again. A silent reminder that the fight for MiG Alley is far from decided. But Black Thursday does not end the air war. If anything, it reveals what the conflict over MiG Alley has truly become. By the middle of 1951, the skies above Northwest Korea are no longer controlled by a single aircraft. They have become the first sustained battlefield of the jet age. Every day, fighters climb toward the cold upper atmosphere above the Yalu River. Contrails stretch across the sky in long white arcs. Sabres climbing to intercept. MiGs diving from altitude. Pilots on both sides quickly discover something important. Jet combat is different. The dogfights of the Second World War had often lasted several minutes. Fighters turned in tight circles, trying to slip behind the enemy aircraft for a clear shot. Jet fighters change those rules. Speed transforms everything. 2 aircraft closing toward each other at combat speed can approach 1,000 miles per hour combined. The window for firing may last only seconds. A mistake that once cost a pilot altitude can now destroy an aircraft instantly. In this new environment, the rivalry between the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15 and the North American F-86 Sabre becomes one of the most studied aerial contests in history. On paper, the MiG still appears superior. It climbs faster. It can reach higher altitudes. And its cannons deliver devastating firepower. But combat between jet fighters begins to reveal advantages that technical specifications cannot easily measure. Control. At high speeds near the edge of the sound barrier, the Sabre remains stable and responsive. Its hydraulically assisted controls allow pilots to maneuver smoothly even in steep dives or rapid turns. The MiG-15 struggles under those same conditions. At very high speed, its controls become heavy. Pilots sometimes find the aircraft reluctant to respond during sharp maneuvers. In jet combat, those seconds of hesitation matter. The Sabre also carries a technological advantage that many MiG pilots quickly learn to respect. Its radar-assisted computing gunsight. Once an enemy aircraft appears inside the sight, the system calculates the proper lead angle automatically. The pilot simply places the sight on the target and fires. At the speeds of jet combat, that advantage can mean the difference between a hit and a miss. Gradually, Sabre pilots begin to refine their tactics. Instead of chasing MiGs upward into the thin air where the Soviet fighter performs best, they keep the fight at medium altitude where the Sabre handles better at high speed. They dive for speed. They climb only when necessary. And they rely on the precision of their gunsight during the brief moments when the enemy crosses their firing line. The sky above MiG Alley becomes a testing ground for jet warfare. Pilots learn quickly. Altitude becomes energy. Speed becomes survival. Every engagement adds experience, and experience begins to change the balance of the war. Many of the early MiG pilots are veterans of the Second World War. American pilots refer to these skilled opponents simply as honchos. Against them, the battles remain dangerous and unpredictable. But the Soviet Union rotates its air units through Korea over time. The war becomes a place where new pilots gain experience with jet aircraft. The replacements who arrive are often younger, less experienced. Many have only recently transitioned from propeller-driven fighters to jets. Against those pilots, the Sabre begins to gain the advantage more often. Engagements that once ended evenly now increasingly end with MiGs falling from the sky trailing smoke. The myth of the untouchable fighter begins to fade. By the final years of the Korean War, the statistics of MiG Alley begin to reflect this change. During the conflict, American military reports claimed that Sabres destroyed MiGs at a ratio of nearly 10 to 1. But later, historical research told a more cautious story. When Soviet records became available decades later, historians compared the losses reported by both sides. Most modern estimates place the true ratio somewhere between 2-to-1 and 5-to-1 in favor of the Sabre. Even the lower figures confirm an important truth. The MiG-15 was not invincible. It had simply arrived first. Once the Sabre entered the war, the contest changed. Even the most skilled Soviet pilots recognized that the fight had become far more difficult than expected. Among them was Yevgeny Pepelyev. Pepelyev became the leading Soviet ace of the conflict, credited with more victories than any other pilot flying the MiG-15. He flew the aircraft with extraordinary skill and understood both its strengths and its weaknesses. In the right hands, the MiG remained a formidable fighter. But even Pepelyev could not change the deeper reality emerging over Korea. Victory in jet combat required more than raw aircraft performance. It required an entire system. Pilots needed extensive training in high-speed combat. They needed aircraft that remained stable near the sound barrier. They needed reliable weapons, accurate gun sights, and tactics refined through repeated experience. Gradually, the American system behind the Sabre began to show its strength. By the time the Korean War approached its end in 1953, the skies over MiG Alley looked very different from the moment when the MiG-15 had first appeared. The contrails were still there, thin white lines crossing the cold upper atmosphere above the Yalu River. But now, they belonged to both sides, Sabres climbing to intercept, MiGs diving to attack, jet fighters circling through wide arcs of frozen air above a war that continued far below. Then, in September of 1953, something unexpected happened. A North Korean pilot named No Kum-sok took off in his MiG-15 and flew south instead of north. Crossing the front lines, he landed at Kimpo Air Base, the same base where the first Sabres had arrived nearly 3 years earlier. It was the first time the United States obtained a fully intact MiG-15. Until then, American engineers had studied the aircraft only through intelligence reports and combat observations. Now they could examine it directly. Test pilots flew the captured aircraft and compared its performance against the Sabre under controlled conditions. The results confirmed what many Sabre pilots had already learned during combat. The MiG-15 was a powerful aircraft. It climbed exceptionally well, it reached extreme altitudes quickly, and carried devastating cannon armament. But it was not the unstoppable superfighter that early reports had suggested. At high speed, its controls could become difficult to manage. In certain situations, the aircraft could enter sudden spins that inexperienced pilots struggled to recover from. Against a well-trained Sabre pilot flying an aircraft designed for stability and precision at high speed, those weaknesses mattered. When No Kum-sok later spoke about the aircraft he had flown in combat, his description surprised many observers. He did not describe an invincible machine. He described a good fighter, but not the best. In his own words, the Sabre had been the better aircraft. By the time the Korean War ended in 1953, the contrails over MiG Alley had written the opening chapter of a new era in aviation history. For the first time, jet fighters had fought each other in sustained combat. They had tested new aircraft designs, new weapons, and new tactics in the thin air above a frozen battlefield. The MiG-15 arrived over Korea with the reputation of an untouchable fighter. For a short time, that reputation seemed justified. But the long white contrails above the Yalu River revealed a deeper truth about air combat. Aircraft alone do not decide victory. The outcome depends on the system behind the machine. Training, technology, tactics, and the skill of the pilot who must bring them together in the few seconds that decide a fight. The Soviet pilots who first flew the MiG-15 into MiG Alley believed they possessed an unbeatable aircraft. The Sabre pilots who met them in the winter sky believed something different. They believed the fight had not yet been decided. And in the fading contrails above the Korean peninsula, the answer to that challenge was written across the sky.